Hello everyone, today a new topic that never really discussed, especially in this key in particular, relative to the current state of Europe, meant more or less, but not entirely, as the European Union. Given last year's start of my series of strategic analysis on Ukraine, I thought that it would be important not to start a series on Europe per se. We can do it, but this is not quite at least conceived as part of it, but let's say giving more background on the current European situation, especially considering the fact that most of my viewers come from either the Anglosphere or places like, I noticed, Germany or Italy, even way more, than France and other also big European countries. And the thing is, this is very interesting for a number of reasons. I will not actually touch on these because, for example, Germany and Italy are apparently, at least according to stats, right, countries that feel sort of more puzzled about the current situation than, say, the UK and France. I think there is actually a lot of interesting debunking to make regarding different aspects of this whole. And this video is not even per se aimed at challenging the notion that I think to be incorrect, in fact, of alleged European weakness. It wants actually to warn, saying Europeans, but also showing a great part of my American followers that constitute, again, a very sort of consistent chunk of the world, in relative terms, the largest, what it is from this side of the aisle that sort of we're thinking about the whole thing. Naturally, it's an immense topic. So I thought for today to stick to essentially the perspective that our competitors have on us, then looking at European potential and also action for that matter already, also making a final remark on the current strategic situation in the war in Ukraine. The leitmotif of this video is also the necessity of federal Europe. Again, I can't make a premise about everything because I noticed that there are people who, when they dislike my content for whichever reason, they claim that basically I don't discuss certain things all in one, or that I promise that I'm going to talk about all this stuff and don't realize that I literally make multiple hours long videos every day dealing with a topic at a time in great depth, right, in order to eventually sort of reconnect everything in a single issue. Today, for example, we'll not talk about immigration. These are all things that I already expressed a lot of opinion on, right, and that in any case witness important changes in the political trend. More than else, I'm making this video because for the dreadfully, and in this sense also fortunately, short experience that I had on X, I realized that there is I don't really think like most propaganda that, falsehood sticks at all. In fact, I'm not really worried about that. But I realized that many kids that, if you're born after the year 2000, and your brain is literally that empty, that you filled it not with conventional culture, education, and standards, and just by essentially rotting your neurocognitive capacity on X, that maybe there is still a way you can come out of it in looking at things in a bit more consistent terms. I hardly ever spoke on YouTube from, let's say, collective European perspective, never really addressed any major political European issue, never really talked about the European Union. And in this sense, I consider myself more like an observer of this. My video today might have been written by anyone, at least in a broader Western situation. And as you know, I tend to sort of detach quite substantially in my analysis from the standpoint in order to provide sort of more accurately objective assessment as possible. Naturally, it's difficult to do this in this case, but that's what you're also here for, as you're probably interested in these topics as I am. And so we will talk about everything. We'll talk about Russia, we'll talk about China, we'll talk about the United States. And we'll address some questions even that you posed me in my recent video about Ukraine, because I sort of had a long introduction, as I usually do, on the political, it's an international situation. And the vision of Trump is interesting. And I follow possibly even more American political commentaries than European ones. In that, there are some things we not much lag behind in particular, but we work really in a different way. And so a more unified narrative in Europe would be better. I can't say that I'm sort of trying to be that, but rowing towards that direction is definitely a step. So, federal Europe. I don't need to explain why political unity makes strategic strength. All right, the fundamental obstacle, and it's not like we aren't getting there, right? I've always sort of been positive about the unique European capacity, if anything, by historical inertia, to have a federal approach to the old continent's affairs. Like there is no way at this point in history that we can't recognize each other as distinct countries, nations, peoples, and at the same time not seeing how obvious the necessity of a European unity and union really is. And this has been always the complaint, not just of federalists, because mostly Europe, in that sense, also followed in the footsteps. Like the first proponents of European federation were Americans, famously enough, right? We'll talk about that if you're interested in political theory. And obviously, in that sense, also model after the young United States. Back in the day, it's striking for, of course, a European to see certain things happening in the outer space, and especially also in the online one, social media, etc. I see really lots of Europeans, paradoxically the more Americanized ones, that tend to freak out too much. And I do think it does reflect some level of sort of not even necessarily positive development that mirrors the general sort of sentiments in the United States, general approaches, sensitivities across the Atlantic. And with my videos, as you have understood by now through this sort of strategic analysis, I've always had a much colder approach. I never really indulge into this kind of emotivism in the sense, oh my God, now there is this news, it must be that. Everything explodes. It's not even media outlets wanting to, of course, get the clicks in the moment or whatever. It's literally that you should have been at this point so habituated to this kind of charade, this carousel, that, nothing actually interests you anymore. And there is also a lot of apathy, but also a lot of ignorance as a cause. So that's the thing that, if anything, bothers me the most. But maintaining control in the eye of the storm is actually, and also traditionally speaking, one of the single most beautiful things ever. We're definitely not in the eye of a storm, right? We are actually still in one of the most peaceful times in history. Things have worsened in the last decades, but overall, we're still in a very good place that, especially again from a European perspective, make all these claims about alleged European weakness, especially to the extent that Europe is normally represented like, pretty absurd, right? I would say some of the punchiest issues that people bring up is rightly indeed immigration issues. There's been, as you know, a recalibration also in European policy in the last couple of years regarding certain dynamics. It's definitely not enough, but for the sake of argument, because I told you we're not going to discuss that today. Like when you look, for example, at, depending on how you want to look at this, right? Because there is an extremization, for example, of racialism online that mostly comes from the United States. Interestingly enough, well, if that's mostly the issue, who is really more blipped up? between Europe and the United States. I don't think it's entirely about that, but there are issues as long as definitely some people bring their own cultures, countries, people are always unequal. There is always a superior and there is always an inferior, and this is valid for everyone, right? It's like also the point of the racialistic standard. What do you draw the line? And there is always someone who's going to be, say, fairer or darker than you. Like the problem is, at that point, why would you even bond? Why would they even bond with you? That's what I always pointed out. Like if you are always seeking for a better person, why would that person want to be with you as a consequence? So politics, history, culture are always complicated. In any case, it's a problem. I've been sort of very vocal about the fact, not too vocal, but very explicit at least about the fact that migration is a good thing in line of principle. Then how do you enact it is a completely different thing. And if anything, I would subscribe to a much more energetic policy in that direction that I think is going to escalate, as a matter of fact, as things are actually going to get worse. But politically speaking, regarding probably the institutional profile of the European Union, the fundamental obstacle to a federal European Union remains the concerted opposition it elicits from the world's principal powers, each of which derives strategic advantage from perpetuating a continent that is economically prosperous yet politically fragmented, militarily reliant, and thus amenable to external manipulation rather than a sovereign entity commanding autonomous defense structures, a singular foreign policy, and decisive regulatory and industrial authority on the global stage. There's a lot of stuff. It's not the first time we see this in our historical content. Politically divided and economically rich is a recipe for troubles, but it's also a much better place to be than underdeveloped fringe, right? And historically speaking, what normally happens by this point is that nobody really manages to conquer this place in a truly direct sense, right? We've seen it recently, for example, in the videos about the Italian wars. We've seen it at different other times. For example, in the wake of the same logic that we just expounded the last generations, it's not like we were sort of depauperated by the Americans historically. There was always, aside from the strong affinity between the two sides of North Atlantic, evidently a specific necessity of developing Europe. If you look at the Marshall Plan, there's never really been anything similar to it by scale and purpose. And in history, I want to make a video about that. And that's definitely not because, the Americans, the Western allies in general lost 100,000 soldiers out of being good Samaritans towards Western Europeans. I mean, we were actually the fascists. So what was done was very politically sort of long-sighted, very strategically sound, but it did not uniquely derive either from the Soviet threat per se, right? And in any case, it's something that worked pretty well, meaning that even immigration-wise, most of the issues that we have been seeing is something that mostly started from 20 years ago, right? You can't say that even the obvious roots laying in the sort of leftistic ideology, structuralism, and Marxism from the 1960s and 1970s decisively shifted Europe towards any kind of sort of leftistic reality, right? What happened actually in Europe in the last up to a few years ago was something that the United States, as it always happens because it's basically the precursor of these ideologies, was even much more radical in nature. Like in Europe, this is something I would like to especially explain for Americans that wonder about this if they're not aware of it, that we've never really, as Europeans, we don't fully engage in this kind of stuff. Not in the type of ideology, but in ideology per se. Right, our media, for example, depending on where you live, because again, the UK is Europe as well. I've always said that. I will never deny that. But of course, it is the single most Americanized country in our continent, and there is no doubt that it sort of follows some of the most similar patterns, and the same of the United States, and the same Americans look at Europe, and when they want to blame it also for the more radical, progressive kind of thing, they can easily look at the UK and say, okay, well, that's Europe. No, that's just actually a minority part of Europe. And even though parts of Europe that, again, were sort of more Americanized, in this sense, oddly becoming more progressive, certain parts of Germany, of Scandinavia, through different avenues, historically also, tended to be the more affected by this radical dynamic, right? France as the seat, at least, of a sort of robust, liberalistic, and in many ways leftistic also ideology, but also simply because these are the more developed countries out there, the ones also with a staunch colonial past and an early, let's say, immigration, differently from other countries in the East, that in any case are not much sort of their traditional as we may think. Simply they're poor, nobody wants to go there, right? Which in any case has its advantages, as especially fiscal compact through German, French, and Italian money is actively making, say, Central Eastern European countries, post-socialist ones, boom, which is something that probably the biggest elephant in the room, and that is also a policy of extreme success. I mean, look at Poland, look at Romania. It's undeniable that the system works, and that also I think there is just not much of a culture about what is technically European Union was. There's no doubt also there were lots of shortcomings, right? The entire concept of union, I remember I was studying these things then, a decade ago, in some depth. Even the definition of European Union, it's something very loose in a broader international situation. And that's a level of fault, because again, in federal terms, an increase of this power shouldn't have anything to do with the sort of amalgamation, or at least the homogenization of European identity at the detriment of the national ones. This is a concept that, again, as Europeans, actually we understand very easily. And it's very weird how the European Union has become the scarecrow per se, as if we were basically under some kind of radical, totalitarian, leftistic regime that does only that, and they always wanted to do that. The European Union did terrible things. Probably the worst thing in absolute terms was the Green Deal, even worse than sort of unregulated immigration policy that comes immediately there, more or less at the same level. That's arguable, which really was worse. But as we've seen, things could immediately change direction, and even without too much of a fuss, honestly. Countries that obviously have more concentrated power in terms of actual executive, etc., like even in the United States, are obviously probably more radicalized. I mean, just think about the concept of democratic republican per se and how it works. In Europe, we have a very different system. We are a bit more classical, a bit more politically, say, classically liberal about our institution, about our parties. And if anything, we're probably on the brink of some important change, not in the way it was prognosticated. Like even for the far right to take over, like it's not really necessary. It just takes a normal center-right government that simply starts enforcing anti-immigration laws and sort of becomes harsher. This is already happening in terms of crime crackdowns, etc. And it is predictable for the same reason that it happened in every similar time in history where these dynamics were happening. There is a massive expansion of a great civilization that normally occurs without much of a check and a balance, without regulation. This was an early issue, the European Union regulating how jobs really work, for example. How this can be sort of uniformly administered across the Union. And let's say at that point, there is an increase in authoritarian tendencies as well as a sort of crackdown on individual liberties. And this is actually not much of a positive thing, because and we are unique in the world. This is what I would like to stress about Europe, that our solidarity in terms of political union is unlike anywhere else, right? The United States are historically homogeneous countries. All right, in terms of national, linguistic, originally ethnic identity, there were different groups, but they were all anglicized. There was as long as the sort of the machine rose up consistently, a great capacity of amalgamation, right? And back in the day, if you look at the Irish, at the Italians, even at again other groups that maybe they're the word the religious, the racial issue, but let's say nobody really liked each other. Here, I mean, this is really typical also of any other colonial country. Mixing different peoples usually does not end up well unless there is, again, a great coagulative capacity of growth and therefore commitment, collective achievement. That was the case of the United States for a long time. In Europe, we're much more courageously rooted in our different national spaces, and yet, paradoxically, these countries are radically similar. There is nothing like this in the world. I mean, countries that have different language, different ethnic backgrounds, different histories also in terms of development and so on, but they understand each other easily and clearly as Europeans, and that share actually an enormous deal of that. Like, you don't have any of this anywhere in the world, right? And especially with this kind, for example, of just civilizational development, of course, and political awareness in that direction. So I would say that, first of all, Europeans are unavoidably going, as they did in the past in different ways, going to stick together against sort of major threats, common enemies, and more. We could be also the worst enemies of ourselves, but if you think about it, until basically the 20th century, there was never a major risk of countries' dissolution per se. Even when you look at, I don't know, the partitions of Poland, or even in the Balkans, when you look at the Ottoman Empire, fundamentally, those peoples historically remain always those peoples. Changed, brutalized, whatever, but you can easily sort of look at late antiquity and realize, or even before that, we've seen it also from the Bronze Age, and there was already, if you look at corded ware, bell beaker, etc., like very specific pools, right? There was a Gaul, there was an Italy, there was something else, even in the center of Europe, something that is akin to Germany. There was an Iberian Peninsula. It was always the same. It's not merely a geographical issue. It's never been. Geopolitics does not exist, as a matter of fact. It's something mystical, it's something metaphysical. I will not, again, digress on our more habitual topics in that key. But it's important to recognize because it definitely sets us apart from any other people in the world, right? And people tend to make strange comparisons, also to undermine this or that country, also abroad, in analysis that are so unbalanced that when you compare them with other countries, you realize that whoever makes them does not know that there is a wall picture, that there is and especially all this kind of hatred towards Europe and claims of basically the fact that we would be living in a totalitarian regime, or whatever, those are obvious provocations. Nobody has really even taken them seriously, right? If you are a person who, I don't know, lives in the United States or even lives within Europe, with civil wars, and you think that somehow in some certain places in Europe you are basically under some dictatorial rule because you can't speak, you can't say a thing without going to jail, whatever. You're either ignorant or most of the times together, you're lying, right? I don't want to enter in specific realities. It's, for example, what happened in the United Kingdom is one of sort of the most disturbing things. Look at the scandals of which were they Pakistanis or Afghans or whatever, the rape and so on. But that also derives from the fact that, first of all, the UK has very strong unitary political control, right? This is a very strong historical thing. Secondly, and without entering the individual circumstances, and regardless of the political direction, it was definitely wrong, and their politicians try desperately to say, at least not to openly admit what really occurred in a broader historical perspective with immigration, etc. This entire notion that you would simply go to jail because you posted for a Facebook, well, if you incite violence, right? This is regardless of political factionalism. Like if you're literally saying go out there, kill all those people, like you're actively inciting to some sort of massacre, you are going to pay for that. Okay? If you insult a person, right? Because this is how far it went. Like in all civilized countries, everywhere in the world, all over Western legal traditions, civil law, common law, you can't go out there, insult a person, and simply think that you can't go scot-free away with that. The enactability of these laws is debatable, right? It's obvious that there can't be a policeman behind every corner, and that there are certain provisions that are evidently more political and sort of more enforced. But in general, like this fake idea of free speech, infringed free speech, is a completely nonsensical one. I mean, everybody should be, in a sense, free to speak until, by speaking, which is a right that that is still preserved, you're actually going to damage somebody, right? We don't even have to go as far as defamation. If you go back to Roman or Germanic law, there are very severe fines for undermining somebody for no reason and for the malicious and deceitful purpose of just harming this person. This is normal. In every civilized country, you risk getting prosecuted because of that, and it's always been the case. The fact that this eventually gets obviously politicized in certain directions and or seems like too harsh in certain directions, well, try to make your ideas worth so that they actually bring to any actual, they're conducive to any actual civil process in order to achieve that, because it's just lesser people that recur to violence on a regular basis. Violence, most of the times, is a bad idea. Sometimes it's a good idea. Rarely, it's actually the best idea. And everybody should be trained to exterminate the largest amount of people possible at every moment. That's why we have a military, thank God. And the same goes, in a sense, with public authority. To me, public authority is untouchable. I mean, if you really want to make an insurrection and a revolution, like, I don't know, like in Iran or wherever it is possible, that is a situation where it's come to that on a collective basis. But if, as those four lesser people that go out there trying to damage public and private property, that want to harm and injure the sort of public authority or whatever in general, you cannot expect but being destroyed, physically destroyed. I mean, it's the most basic elementary proof of civilization to understand whether that is the point or not, right? Especially as it's not a major insurrection. I'm talking specifically in this sense by proportion. Again, what the Iranians are doing in a country that is an embarrassment of the dignity of mankind, objectively, it's perfectly fine as a redemptional thing. If we're talking some simple frenesenic idiot in any other Western country with no sign of any trace of mass insurrections or revolt or whatever, just uses this kind of violence, make them a mental check. These are fully undeveloped people, and if the police put them on a wheelchair for life, probably they would understand something about it, and there would be nothing bad concerning it at the same time. I'm absolutely for crackdown, breaking heads, arms, whatever. That's absolutely what police should be trained for and should be actually let a bit more loose for. Perhaps it's my tyrannical side that is exaggerating, because indeed everything has eventually a political resonance and you don't want to make things escape too much. But let's say narratives are important, and to spread false ones is only undermining the fabric of society, right? A healthy country is a country that did not get to the level of immigration issues that we witnessed to in the West or elsewhere, for that matter. I mean, just look at the numbers of Islamic immigrants in the Russian Federation. Absolutely, they have nothing to envy to the ones of sort of the most unchecked sort of immigration destinations in Western Europe. And so the same goes for the United States, with millions of people that enter the border for years and years, to say the least. So this is not, again, I don't see anything unique about Europe, if not for the fact that we seem to be more capillarly capable of handling certain matters differently from, again, the vastity in certain countries that we just stated, right? So it's mostly a problem of policy. If the only reaction that you have to these policies is to be sort of, I don't know, a renegade, a rebel, or whatever, it means that you belong to an inferior people that is not able to civilly solve the problem with the rational use of public force, including in a violent fashion, because you're evidently not able to convince for your own ideas, not because your ideas also may not are wrong, let's say, in line of principle, but because you're too weak as a culture to do anything about that. That's what I always said about, again, the right, left. It's useless to pretend that, I don't know, if you are from the right, as I am, and say the left in your country is a bunch of depraved lunatics and sort of criminals and lesser people and genocidal maniacs, your side, your right, as part of the same country, is anything scholarly better. You're the literal same people, right? And the truth about politics, it seems to me, is that there's just a solid, say, upper middle class establishment of actually competent, of actually educated, of actually affluent people that actually run the system, and we mostly have to fix the issues of lesser people and their disasters, right? And that's how the thing really is all across the board, right? Now, starting from our competitors, let's talk about Putin for once, because, as you know, he served as Russia's president or prime minister, let's say, as you know, there was a Farsesque sort of in-between interludium with Medvedev, etc. But since 1999, in whose worldview draws heavily from a sense of historical grievance over the Soviet Union's 1991 collapse, right? Which, in fact, Putin himself has called the greatest, quote-unquote, geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, right? Which is, very debatable. Views that European Federation as an existential threat to its preferred operational environment. And Wu views European Federation as an existential threat to its preferred operational environment. Now, the statement in and itself is ridiculous, but it tells you how the idea of a Soviet collapse is, Putin is fixated with a sense of terroristic, authoritarian, dictatorial unity, right? The unity of Russia historically is not a unity of people who cohesively cement an old, uniform, national, felt identity. It's based on essentially a major crackdown on anyone who exhibits any sort of higher merit than the other. That's how the Soviet Union was established, for that matter. The Tsarist Empire was obviously yet another abomination of the dignity of mankind in and of itself. Like, you can't be a fully sort of namely on paper traditional country, but if you suck in qualitative terms, you're nothing, right? This is just like, I don't know, by countries ruled by the Sharia or whatever, aside from all the flows of Islam, theologically speaking. I mean, a culture does not recognize the Trinity cannot really go very far in imperial Catholic traditional history. Remember that Putin's brother was killed by the Nazis during the siege of Leningrad, right? And frankly, if the Nazis had finished off the work with his parents, at least, like, say, everything goes the way it had gone, like, we would probably live in a much better place. We may never know. Telling the truth, everything is unpredictable, right? But you have to understand, in this sense, the person behind that, because sometimes, like, you really wonder about politicians. We've seen it also with Trump, not making comparisons at all. I mean, simply saying that there is a political discourse, as was saying before, narratives that would like to make you believe that whatever these people say is what they actually think. I honestly don't know whether Putin actually believes that for example, the variety, the difference of European country is something irreconcilable with our European unity. This is something that he stated multiple times. Like, he would say things like, I don't know, I don't remember in which case, but it was quite fitting that, yes, he was talking about capitalism, I think, or democracies. No, I think it was talking about democracies. This was after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I don't remember where this was asked, but you can easily find it online. It was asked, say, what do you think about democracy, the democratic world, whatever, how it was called. As you know, I myself, as Schwerpunkt, don't like the term democratic, not because of what it defines, but because it improperly defines that, right? We don't live in democracies, right? And democracies would be something more akin to countries ruled by the fourth estate, which never existed in the history of mankind. There was always a higher establishment that, of course, is more capable and definitely qualitatively better and runs the thing. But he was basically told, like, what do you think that keeps these countries together? Right, and he says, really, he didn't answer the question, but he said something that really exemplifies his mentality. He says, what can we say? I don't know, the UK is a monarchy. France is a presidential republic, right? Germany is a federation. So he was basically trying to represent, as obviously also Russian propaganda historically tried to do, to say this all weird, grotesquely caricatured, terrible capitalists and despoiled, immoral people that are not as united as the collectively, underdeveloped Russians that can't boast, the cohesion. That also does not exist. I mean, Russia has literally hundreds of ethnicities, and again, a disproportionately large amount of Muslim population, for that matter, for not talking about the levels of socioeconomic disruption, 6% of people living in conditions of slavery, and more. Now, we're not talking about that per se, right? But the fact in general, and I don't think that Putin is really stupid. I mean, I think that he can be, but he is highly intelligent in certain aspects. He was practical and capable in his own field, but definitely what happened in 2022 showed that, if anything, he was alienated from the world, that his yes men lied, that it was a terrible catastrophe, that he sort of foamed over what happened immediately in the first weeks of the war. And definitely that is not the signal of a fully developed people or country, but whatever you want to call that. In any case, what is more interesting is that he would find European Federation, and already much of what we actually are as a European Union, an existential threat to the idea of essentially an hegemonic Russia. That was something that actually in Europe we had up to a few decades ago, because of exhaustion after World War II and defeat, of course, of those powers that had kept the Russians at bay, because, of course, a part of the West sided with the Soviet Union. But it's an old story. And again, I'm going to make a video about the original concept of geopolitics as it was created in the 19th century, because it really referred to a particular area in Central and Eastern Europe, and ironically where the war in Ukraine is also partly in part fought today, essentially from the Baltic to the Black Sea at large. That if you look at the Cold War, indeed was what was controlled from the other bloc, by the other bloc, and that therefore, at least in conventional force, because again geopolitics does not exist, witnessed the superiority of the Warsaw Pact forces on European soil, right? But still evidently not the capacity of controlling Europe, that was instead dominated at large by the West. It was more powerful in a broader sense, otherwise, again, it would have gone under. And guess would collapse at the end of the day. So we also made a video about that regarding Thatcher, Wojtyla, Reagan. So the Russian state apparatus has long exploited divisions among European nations through calibrated energy supply manipulations, disinformation campaigns, and targeted political intimidation, allowing here and there gains without confronting, at least in a broader sense, unified resistance. This is at least what would also be told. I believe it's good to inform, to alert, to warn really people about the potentially, again, escalatory aims of the Russians. The truth is that Russia, even were it to end at some point, not even necessary to specify what kind of outcome could be, but end the war in Ukraine could have in years the capacities to, let's say, have a competitive conventional force, especially historically in ground forces, personnel, etc., but being, in any case, otherwise incredibly behind and incapable of taking on any realistic target. Not even in the Baltics. Like in the Baltics, yes, there are debates regarding how NATO would intervene in case of an attack to the Suwalki Gap, because that's sort of difficult to defend, and also in the Baltics, there are just so many forces that you can use. But in a regular sense, like the reason why, of course, Russia actually did not really achieve much ever in this. Every once in a while, we hear of some, train tracks that are blown up, something that went on fire. But there's a very small thing, and it's obvious, especially from different months ago, probably also because of reasons of negotiation. Russians, if you realize, have actually largely stopped this kind of sabotages, and they're scratches, really. They're just some sort of psychological harassment. They're not any constitutive, structural, kind of effective sort of gain that can lead to any broader political strategic advantage. In fact, if you look at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, you remember how much Russian misinformation was there. Today, you don't actually hear much of that, right? There are just the lesser people that try to make it. Many of them are actually bots. If you look at the patterns to which they interact, whatever, they try to undermine whatever sort of political side, sort of proposal or direction would be at least sort of imaginarily connected with a more united Europe, or say imaginarily being opposed by Europeans that at large are supportive of the idea of a more unified Europe and really don't care about this thing. I think that, again, in the early years in particular, this propaganda failed, right? It wasn't even scary because it was so full of lies. I mean, there is no other way to point it out. It does not work. Lies, remember that theologically, in Indo-European theology, lies do not work by definition. There is no way to successfully obtain something through lying if not by undermining someone, right? It's to say you're not actually gaining something. You're just basically habituating people to think in a certain way. Maybe this is what the Russians think, but this is not what European politics or strategy or society really shows, right? And so they're really ephemeral and, in my opinion, absolutely unsuccessful endeavors, for which, by the way, Russia spent something even in Italy, right? There is all sort of the potential asymmetry of sort of psychological, but you can't control thought. This is another great deficit of the Russians. They were habituated to sort of enforce a brutal regime on a ship people that at any time in history never demonstrated any qualitative capacity whatsoever. They don't understand the West, right? Especially if you feel inferior to it, as you are, obviously you're going just to, what do lesser people do that they can't achieve? So they're just going to say, oh no, denying reality, divorcing yourself from reality. And in fact, also much of the problem that I've seen in the last years is not much Russian propaganda. Again, not a problem in my view. At least it's fun to debunk and easy to debunk very easily with logic, reason, facts, effortlessly, given the premises, by the way, could be much more intense. It's not really. What really bothered me is a bit European, so Western apathy in general, but secondly, the fact that certain media outlets, for the sake of, okay, we'll get this news because, I don't know, maybe they calculated it would sound in a certain way at a certain hour when people watch the page the most, etc., in a competitive sense, would say, I don't know, a completely worthless small village in Ukraine at some point was captured by the Russians that declared that and posted it somewhere as if that was any major strategic achievement whatsoever. And then maybe even not talking at all about the war and the things that actually went badly for Ukraine. And so showing you that there is no logic in that at least the quality of media information is pretty scarce, it's pretty low, and most people literally do not have the tools even to evaluate that or to find any sort of reliable source and access because again, most people that are incompetent are also less powerful as individuals, and so they don't care in general. And so whatever they're going to substitute information with, proper, correct information with, is not going to be expendable. Because if you get out in in the world, you will immediately realize that that thing is just like a cheap psychological trick for people that don't know how the world actually works. I mean, even in basic sort of ad personam level. Now, a Europe organized under federal principles, possessing integrated military forces and coherent strategic planning, would dismantle the asymmetry. Russian opposition would become at that point null, because how do you even compete with a power that is actually superior to you in a military sense? You have failed clamorously, incompetently, and embarrassingly against Ukraine. That was not sort of the last military in the world, but in general, like if your ambitions are allegedly the ones, like in propagandism only, of reconquering all sort of the post-socialist kind of whatever, well, that's useful for the lesser people that you're going to send to die in the trenches, and nobody will ever care or know about they even existed. Nobody gives a shit about them. I mean, seriously. I mean, we don't, in Europe, we don't give a fuck about this. Like, we live our life without even caring that you exist. This is the problem, right? And that's their problem. That's the problem that they have. That the entire narrative on which they rely is the one that is at the use and consumption of a post-totalitarian people that will take several generations before it can't get anywhere in any meaningful sense. And in any case, when things improve, people, everything can collapse for the worse even, but not much in the sense that you can keep them to think what you want. That's unfortunately not the case. Nobody has ever managed to actually control. Like, you can actually intimidate people, but you can't really control what they actually think. You can't control a system in general with a human dimension. You can't tell what is going to happen 4 months from now in any sound strategic sense, right? And any broader narrative is just for the mentally feeble. And the mentally feeble really make very good cannon fodder, which was always sort of Russian strategy to begin with. Not quite. I mean, the Russians did have, historically, everybody fights with a strategy, but I mean, great part of the strategy was surely based on that, at least. And again, a European unity would foreclose the divide and rule mechanism that have sustained Moscow's influence over Eastern and Central European states. We're already doing that. I'm talking in hypotheticals here or in futures, but again, there is already a European Union. We already stripped all those countries except Belarus from Russia. The notion that, again, even countries like Hungary or Slovakia were aligned with Russia, this is something just like probably you may have a mental problem to believe, because that's just like fringe countries that try to sort of leave off the sort of the immediately expandable, but are entirely dependent on us, right? And are not going to, as they aren't in any meaningful sense, siding with Russia. Also because they actually know what it was to live under them, and or at least, of course, the mentally feeble has fantasies. We're just talking about that in the other question and answer video, but it's just stupid kids. Now, we're not talking about the establishment of those countries, as a matter of fact. Yes, they're not who knows what, but in general, like, there are qualitative people. Again, never underestimate the neurocognitive damage of post-Soviet impact, but sort of be sure that these countries were well happy to free themselves from Soviet tyranny, right? Even in a broader Warsaw Pact sense. Now, Putin's imperial ambitions, rooted in reconstituting spheres reminiscent of Tsarist and Soviet dominance, and often framed as restoring, quote, historically Russian lands, or a, quote, Russian world, encompassing shared East Slavic heritage, but not only, but to them, like, in the narrative, everything has to be, everything Russia can get, they will get. Right? This is their entire diplomacy. And this is the diplomacy of a desperate person, right? And this can happen even just in a rhetorical sense, because there is a patchwork of vulnerable elements that can be pressured bilaterally, isolated, and destabilized sequentially, right? Again, the core of Europe is unavoidably and ineliminably in Western hands, in truly a united European hand, and part of a much broader and the greatest military alliance in the history of mankind. Thinking otherwise at this point, even in terms of a conventional war between Russia and the West at any imaginary point, ridiculous, because of obviously the nuclear arsenals that we have that are completely sufficient, even in Europe alone, to destroy Russia, as a matter of fact, but just in a mechanism of mutual destruction, right? And when you have the instinct of a rat, historically speaking, just defending and surviving, you know that you're never going to use those weapons actually, because the only thing that you're trying to do is to survive, and at the same time covering the embarrassing of being still a severely underdeveloped people. Now, a cohesive European defense architecture would, however, transform the continent from a permeable frontier in some realities into a fortified barrier, compelling Russia to confront collective deterrence rather than exploiting national insecurities. And at that point, the comparison that is just today, conventionally speaking, would not probably even allow Russia to exist. I mean, Siberia is already lost, right? Siberia is not Russian anymore. This is going to be explicit in the next generations. I mean, what kind of you can argue, yes, of course, that Western Europe is Western Russia is more compact, and that even though sort of its population is overwhelmingly and sort of incredibly negatively distributed in any political and strategic sense, that's not a good choice when you sort of wave nuclear threats that will remain always nuclear threats, because you take out Moscow and everything is done. But in any case, nobody would go at war in that sense. I mean, unless you really want to end the world entire, and or at least anything that resembles your country. Passing to China, we'll see now essentially that Russia is by far, we'll see it in the end, by the same Russian admission that will cite very specific pro-Russian and Russian voices, probably from the backdrop of Ukraine and Donbass, that explicitly say this is, a massive failure. It failed big time, and you're by far, among all these players, Russia is by far the weakest. That's also what we have. I mean, between, let's see now, Europe, China, United States, and more, Russia is by far the weakest. And not just because of the war, that naturally has cannibalized so many resources at this point. If you look at my last lesson on the war in Ukraine, you will understand better in which kind of dramatic. In fact, I think the war is winding down. Like, they predicted this would start from fall of 2025. This is apparently stretching further. But the age of sort of territorial conquest is over. All right? They're done with that. Xi Jinping, our favorite Winnie the Pooh. There are beautiful sort of codes of sort of certain units, especially American of the United States Air Force in the Pacific, show Winnie the Pooh passed by a missile. It's sort of beautiful, and he's just literally identical to that. But he has indeed led China as General Secretary of the Communist Party. We would like to remind you of a little thing. We're still talking about communism in 2026, interestingly enough. Communist Party since 2012 and president since 2013, emphasizing a vision of an quote-unquote equal and orderly multipolar world to counter perceived U.S. hegemony. Regards partial European emancipation from American dominance as conducive to a multipolar order that dilutes U.S. hegemony and opens avenues for Chinese influence. Americans, listen to this, right? Aside, we'll talk about America in a while now. And as you know, I'm actually very skeptical of the fact that the United States is moving in any meaningful sense away from its European alliances, and that the entire world order is being redrawn. No, this is not happening, all right? And there are also very specific reasons for that. But China, and I would like to state something I didn't say before, but remember when we talk about the politically divided and economically developed? All right, the entire notion that Americans shouldn't spend for the European defense is a moronic concept, because in the entire history of mankind, if you can control someone, it's a positive thing. Like, you are living off of that, you're profiting of that. As Europeans, we understand it fantastically, because you have managed to keep us more divided. I mean, for some time, it was also our own fault. If France had not bailed out of the Common European Defense Treaty in the 50s, at this point, we would have also a pretty much more robust core of unitary European military. But it's obvious for China that wants to appease everyone, right? Russians in diplomatic dealings want just to lie continuously, so to hoping to trick the other side. It is obviously always superior historically, that they are serious, and they're not. China wants everybody to be happy, wants to be this big thing, and into a world where there are sort of many other things similar to her, and just sort of keeping to rise, more or less minding their own business in a sort of aggressive, but still at the end of the day, as always in Chinese history, isolated dimension, right? It's not like China hasn't, of course, sort of invested in other countries and so on, but the idea of a more autonomous Europe is something that the Americans should really fear, because of the emboldening of Chinese power, and in this sense, of a greater difficulty of coping with it in the Pacific. Yet, Beijing maintains strict boundaries against any European ascent to peer status, stricto sensu, especially in manufacturing, technological innovation, and norm-setting capacity. Because, as you know, like other European experience, it's full of Chinese here, but you never see them. Right? This is the thing. Like, you see everything. You see Africans, you see Arabs, whatever. They're all there. You never see, a Chinese begging on the street. And they live actually in places that probably not even sub-Saharians live in, all right? Because they're more organized, they're more pressured. They have even some crypto security in some industrial areas because of Chinese workers that go there and that don't have to mingle with the rest of us, whatever. It's incredible, all right? It's all controlled from China. By the way, this is not like a Chinese mafia. This is literally like, these are government people that control that, right? And that's also insane. But why? Because they want, of course, to exploit, still in some sectors, what historically was, the idea of made in China, at this point, sort of made by Chinese in Europe, and gradually spreading and allowing sort of for this acts of connivance because of sort of local economic interest to exist, but also something that's probably going to end, as we will see now. All right. So China benefits from Europe as an open, high-value market, absorbing exports while remaining susceptible of supply chain leverage. This is kind of obvious. This is the entire reason of what we just described. A federal Europe capable of protecting indigenous industries, imposing binding global standards, and restricting market access in response to strategic imperatives would compel China to negotiate with an equal rather than dominate a fragmented partner. And this would also be their nightmare. Right? This video is not much pointing out at which stage we are in this, because largely this is already happening. Right? This is pointing out that basically everybody is scared of Europe. Right? This is the bottom line that we will point out, that nobody can actually, not much put their fingers, but literally their hands on Europe. Right? This is a massive system that cannot be conquered, cannot be dominated, cannot be controlled. And the only people do not understand how sort of fortunate we are in this, it's ourselves. exactly because we already enjoy that superiority. Naturally, this is the main point. China has an overall global reach that is really important, and you may see as threatening, but also something on which they are also dependent. For example, the asymmetry in critical materials underscores this concern. China supplies approximately 70% of the euro area's rare earth imports directly, with effective control through refining dominance that counts for over 90% globally for key elements in many cases, right? And indirect channels via third countries as well. So this is ineliminable to an extent. It's been so far actually also one of the sort of the greatest prevention for any kind of escalation from both sides, but talking especially with Taiwan, etc. We'll talk about Taiwan at some point too, because also regarding the Chinese military capacities, it's good to show sort of making some projections, war games, etc., show how, I don't know, obviously the Americans could get the worst of that, but say in general, nobody knows what the Chinese are at war, right? It's like with the Russians in a modern scale, sort of larger scale war. Until Ukraine, we didn't actually know that. But we know that they actually sucked, and the idea that China is also a paper tiger from many points of view is still a thing. But again, never underestimating competence from everybody's side when it comes to warfare, right? Because that's also important. But the aforementioned position definitely enables Beijing to weaponize dependencies in sectors vital to European green and digital transitions, including solar photovoltaics and battery production, where Chinese firms control overwhelming shares of global capacity. Right? Again, said before, not a fan of green economy, but this is something that in any case will develop to some extent, and that many countries are also in need of, including the Chinese, given if they care about their lungs and the future of their children in terms of pollution, etc. If we think about India, we'll get to that in a while now. That's somehow needed. But we're talking a bigger picture even. Federation would equip Europe to diversify these vulnerabilities systematically, diminishing China's ability to impose costs asymmetrically through export restrictions or selective denials, as demonstrated by measures imposed in April 2025 in retaliation to US tariffs, which curtailed shipments of rare earth magnets by approximately three-fourths in some periods and disrupted downstream industries, followed by further controls announced last October on additional rare earth elements, including ulmium, erbium, thulium, europium, and ytterbium. Related products as well, equipment and technologies with extraterritorial implications requiring licensing, even for foreign-made goods incorporating Chinese source materials or technologies. Although a temporary suspension of the second wave was announced last November, extending further, these actions have already elevated European rare earth prices up to 6 times higher than in China in certain periods, underscoring persistent supply concentration risks that hinder cost competitiveness in manufacturing sectors reliant on these materials for energy, defense, and semiconductors, while also prompting production delays or shutdowns in automotive and other industries exposed through complex global value chains. So this can't be tolerated anymore. Frankly, Europe has a protectionistic character, nature. We're just made for that, right? So a full European Union, a true federation, would very much act not just in that preserving direction, but also an expensive one to get stuff from the outside. I truly believe that a European army would be probably something, I don't know, with a shifting command across, probably outside of Europe, right, operating in different parts of the world, especially in the Mediterranean, to sort of impose European interests. And that's just our vocation historically, colonially speaking, and more. Passing to the United States, under Donald Trump, who returned to the presidency in January of last year for a second non-consecutive term, American policy prioritizes bilateral transactionalism over multilateral partnership, or at least preferring it to some extent, or testing boundaries in that direction. Favoring European governments that remain individually accessible for negotiation, pressure via tariffs and conditional concessions, including territorial assertions such as, again, the entire Greenland issue that, as we've seen, it was nothing as predicted, and that it should make you understand how truly among all these players, this is not just about Trump. And I explained it really about Trump because I don't mind what Trump is doing. In many ways, I think there is this hysteria. Oh my God, look, he wants to seize Greenland. Seriously? I mean, you're an actual person and you believe that the United States wants to seize Greenland, right? There is something called politics, yes, and it can be weird. Statements can be all over the place, whatever. But there is also some more basic reality. There is strategy. There are sort of many more viable options. If you want to read this politically, read it in terms of how tough is Europe really? And what can Trump do just to do whatever? Like if you were, those people who say that we're slaves, vassals, like it's a very strange place where a slave and vassal is even bigger than the one of sort of the alleged master and ruler. And the alleged master and ruler in particular just will threaten to eat up this sort of peripheral. It's not because Greenland is that small, but in general, like to some broader interests. Again, the Americans can simply already build bases there through the treaties that they have, that we have in NATO, etc. So what are we even talking about? The same goes for Canada, right? Do you really feel like if you're a Canadian, seriously, you really feel threatened by the United States? I mean, are you argumenting in any serious sense the possibility that you're going to wake up one day with sort of American tanks rolling in your country? That's interesting, right? And for not saying despicable. So the idea of testing boundaries is, as always, also with these other countries' policies, largely, when being too loud or being too silent, a matter of domestic policy that remains a priority for most countries in most times. Americans are not happy with tariffs, right? They sound like a bad idea, not because of Trump, not because, again, there are the heroic liberal democratic heroes that are fighting against tyranny and oppression or whatever. No, right? In my opinion, ICE should double down on everything that happened. Mistakes happen as well, incompetence happens as well, but to depict any of this as some sort of kind of threat to democracy, frankly, seems utterly ridiculous, especially in a marvelous system of checks and balances that do work, visibly work in the United States, right? For a guy that is evidently not going to do anything outside the system and can't by definition. I mean, the president of France is a much more powerful person in relative terms to the president of the United States, to his country. All right, there are some rigid constraints. You can't do whatever you want. It doesn't work like that. I don't know how people think. You see, feminism spread this nonsensical interest in fiction. We should study history, right? Fiction is for women, and it's fine. Everybody should read fiction. Some fiction is very good. I love fiction, but say, if you're a man, an adult man, and you're more into fiction than you are into actual history, if you think that, I don't know, The Lord of the Rings should fit your historical imagination as opposed to maybe the other way around, you may be a mentally ill person. You may want to check a psychiatrist, all right? It's not normal, right? That sort of average level testosterone man is interested in fiction and projects this at a political level as opposed to actual history, actual reality, actual strategy. It's not normal. It's subnormal. But going back to the topic, again, real, confident, upper middle class establishment, people realize that, of course, tariffs are not a good idea, especially if you are still a dominating empire de facto that derives its power from controlling other countries and stabilizing especially the allied markets in countries that you actually have bases in, that you really control to a strategic degree and protect, and therefore have an interest also in you remaining there, while they don't see that actually they would better off without, or at least in a more unitary sort of value-based partnership, as opposed to, and again, you paid for our defense for a long time. Was it worth it for you? Yes. Right? For us, not so much. This is a problem for us, because you see how exposed we are today, or at least how much we have to bridge in terms of gaps with the proper unified command and military and sort of imperial strategy on our own that we have. Like, this video is not about the European military. If you want, I'm going to make one about that, but we are a might to be reckoned with under any standpoint. All right. Waging war everywhere does not mean you can win everywhere. And by scale, we are, again, something that nobody can tackle this moment in history. In early, and again, to finish the point, tariffs hurt Americans, right? This is not about hurting us Europeans, right? That can be a wake-up call. Americans are going to pay for that price, right? And this is, especially Americans that are affluent enough to make more stuff move. And this is not much a good thing for neither involved. Again, it's a bad thing. I like basically 70% of Trump's policy in general. Definitely tariffs are not a good aspect of this. And not because, again, I'm a European in particular, or in particular come from a country that suffers from this. But, right, it's something that Americans should want. And you see, Trump does act, right? The posture in and of itself is something reminiscent of some sort of disgruntled, conservative / populistic mentality in the United States. But it is an act, because at the end of the day, Trump will do other things, right? If you look at all the propaganda with which we have bombarded us on X last year, when he came to power, how much of that has already been, I mean, the good things you have been called him there for, the most important one, the border, sort of general affirmation of United States national interest in different, also Middle Eastern, for example, policy and so on. That is all something that makes sense and should continue, because there is a very strong reason for making the thing work, right? But all the rest, all the fireworks, all the now America will not fight any other war because otherwise Americans will pay taxes. It really requires a mental deficiency not to understand that the military instrument is to command over other peoples and that you're going to benefit from that. It's a good thing. Civilized peoples do. There is hardly any other indicator of a people's cultural inferiority than isolationism, historically speaking. It's obvious that the United States socio-culturally are collapsing, right? That there is a problem. It's a bigger one. It's not like politically or territorially they are collapsing, but in as the broader world at this point in history, there is an exhaustion, all right? There is a moment of stagnation, of growth in certain from certain standpoints that mostly tend to consolidate and secure what is there, to even define better, if anything, more regionally based power blocks, as opposed to, again, an overreach. But why? Because it's a form of exhaustion. It's not like we're poorer than before, right? We actually could do much more quite easily. But it's that moral exhaustion and a deep anthropological problem in the history of mankind, right? In early 2026, Trump escalated threats for the Greenland. And in fact, as we've seen at Davos, the entire issue now, we will add other 10% tariffs, etc., or escalate that by June, with 1/4 more for Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, and the United Kingdom. For Greenland, were completely reversed. Why? All right, it doesn't make any sense, and it's weird, and it's just mostly a postural attitude. It's just like I want to play games, right? And I want to see what happens if I do, right? This is not a distraction of NATO alliance or whatever. So it's all good if the claimed threats at some point prompted emergency consultations among European representatives, which didn't really go anywhere to begin with. Like you have, figures such as the French President Emmanuel Macron considering activation of use anti-coercion instrument to counter potential economic pressure at some point. But in general, right, where's the threat to NATO in all of this? Right, there isn't. Right, what I would like to stress is that NATO is not equal to we Americans or Europeans are allies for some strange. NATO is just the strategic instantiation of massive system, the single greatest power in the world that has all the interest to remain the greatest power in the world. Point. It's not like America goes its own way or not, whatever. Right? This is something else. It's just like today we didn't talk about the Dmitriev plan and why Zelensky would come up with that. Obviously, because it's saying, look, that the Russians and the Americans had some of that stuff on the table. By the way, this is just a claim. We need to see proper papers. But it's obvious that the Ukrainian president would say, we don't want Americans and Russians to even talk about possible deals, which is something that always happened behind the scenes with anyone. Right? It's just a political move. You must, in political analysis and strategic analysis, separate the two things. You cannot think they go in parallel. They go in parallel, but they're not directly proportional. If somebody says something politically, it doesn't mean that it reflects a specific interest in the moment through the actual state, the literal statement provided. It's something else. It's a mean to an end, and the media does not have any critical capacity normally to address any of this. They will just tell you, oh, look, here it seems like, oh my God, now the Russians and the Americans are aligning themselves. And how can a fully developed human being, provided with civic rights, believe in this? I mean, we could actually and easily impose some legal standards for voting rights at this point, because it's not really possible to think that we depend politically, that there are people that can formally vote under such superstitions. Right? Fortunately, again, we do not live in democracies, because democracies never existed historically, and not like in the usually whiny kind of thing, like because the people do not have power. No, people had always the chance to have all the power they want. It's that they suck and do not have power. That's how it works. It's not because somebody even taking power away from them. Actually, we overly gave voting rights, and that's the result. It doesn't work. It's stupid. It should be reduced. It's just, again, it's not like you should be barred from voting in some autocratic, arbitrary sense. How someone can decide when you can vote by age, or whether you can drive a car, whether you can get a license, whatever you want to do, you should take a test for voting. Because it's not possible that people with sort of evident intellective and educational, probably school shortcomings, are supposed to be valuable for our world. There could be even some pointage thing. You can vote for something and not for something else. Like, it doesn't have like barring entire swathes of the population from voting just per se. It has to be coherent. It has to be tailored to the circumstance. But let's stop pretending that people are equal. It's the stupidest thing that you can ever say. Like, the entire evidence that we have at every level of anthropological inquiry tells us that there are people who are worth more and others that are worth less. Like in any other physical principle, right? Regarding what we just said, although rescinded shortly thereafter, like the entire Greenland thing, this did cause temporary market disruptions, including a 2% drop in the S&P 500 and rising U.S. Treasury yields, and diplomatic signaling of vague sort of framework for future Arctic arrangements discussed with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister, who assumed the NATO role in October 2024. And the episode really illustrates a preference for dealing with tractable national units rather than a compact federal interlocutor. In other words, was Europe a unitary thing? Not even the individual countries would have the embarrassment of saying, but we did this, this would be unavoidable, even in a federation, right? But given that there is a unified political direction, and you say that the system already works, as we've seen. Like, Europe does mobilize at certain paces. There are some sort of core countries that really, like the big six, I don't remember what was the adjective, but say that are going at a speed that obviously can't be dragged. If anything, it's going to guide all the other countries. These are signs of actual European power acceleration, especially in relative terms, because, as we said before, potentially takes so few to do what is needed here. A Europe with autonomous defense capabilities and unified external representation would resist unilateral coercion, negating leverage derived from historical security guarantees or proxy influences in proximate regions. Washington has consistently refrained from fostering a federal European counterpart despite possessing the requisite military and economic instruments. This deliberate choice reflects a calculus that fragmented allies prove more pliable for extracting concessions on trade, defense burdens, or international alignment, but it also shows that Europe is simply not to be commanded, that there are no ways to enforce on Europe even these little tariffs in the bigger picture without creating major backlash and therefore becoming unsustainable or at least worthless, sort of counterproductive for a coherent American international policy. And in any case, also bringing sort of some losses in the United States as well. So again, an attitude that legitimately you may dislike. Again, I don't like tariffs at all. There are sort of many American political commentators, the most the ones with the most robust and classical political understanding of the situation, that say, what's this all about? It's dumb. Work to stabilize the system, not to agitate it, because you're not going to break it. Trump is not going to bring the end of NATO or American-European relations. Again, it's so dumb, especially from those sides that the majority of people who side with Ukraine, that unfortunately are liberals for some reasons. There are obviously many conservatives that do. But this nonsensical attitude, oh my God, no, now we will be on our own. Oh my God, Trump is a dictator who will broker a deal with Putin, whatever, to cut us out of the entire system. We will abandon Ukraine. But do you actually believe this? What did happen so far that suggests that is even a remotely plausible scenario in actual verification with all what is happening, including the war in Ukraine, lots of other issues everywhere? Your fear is that Trump now is sort of the Antichrist, is this destroying the world. Like, again, this is embarrassing. I'm not surprised that, of course, leftists will prostitute their brains to try to act as if they are the saviors of the world while getting ever more deep depth into their sort of alienation from the world itself. But that's the problem. These people are too weak. We don't know what to do with them. We need robust people, right? We need people who restore the awareness of the God-given right of Europeans to lord over the rest of the world. That's how you do that. And again, you don't even have to simply attain that, but that obviously requires cooperation with the United States and vice versa. I'm not even saying that there aren't stupid things that Trump is doing, by the way, for that matter, or his administration at large. The sense that, of course, there is also a lack of a clear plan. There are obviously reasons that we don't hear, we don't see, but of course governments make mistakes. Some of them can be pretty dumb, and it's a ballet mostly modulated, in my opinion, again, domestic policy. Now, these overlapping preferences converge on a shared apprehension of all these peoples. Why? Right? Why? Because Europe can't be dislodged. Its federation would position Europe as a gravitational center for middle powers, namely Japan, the world's third largest. This was until 2022. Germany surpassed it, but it was, in this sense, also the fourth largest economy, in a key U.S. ally in the Indo-Pacific, South Korea, a major technological and manufacturing power, Canada, a G7 member with vast Arctic interests, Australia, a strategic partner in the Asia-Pacific, and potentially others seeking escape from this binary subordination to either Washington, Beijing, or Moscow, right? Which, again, is not even what the real picture is about, because, again, states on their own can't be simply controlled in total. What do? You go at war with some of them, what kind of advantage would it yield in this level of power balance? Doesn't make any sense. There isn't even probably an ideology that is dividing them. You can argue that everybody kind of sucks in their own way. That is warranted, but I personally don't even reason by axes, by blocks. It seems to me that, again, there are countries that go up, others that go down, that this essentially creates issues somewhere and for everybody involved, but it's largely unpredictable. And even though there are obviously some centers of power that are more important than others, have a greater regional reach and so on, Europe preeminently features next to the United States, China, and overwhelmingly, to say the least, over Russia. And mostly at that point just because of nuclear deterrence, not because there is any competitivity there whatsoever. There are certain assets that, of course, as Europeans, we would like to have maintained in terms of Russian energy sort of resources and so on. But in general, like the system, remember people claim, oh my God, now we will remain without gas. Winter is coming. Nobody's talking about this anymore. All right, we still pay for some inflation that is, in any case, due to the entire issue of the war, not just because we don't have Nord Stream 2 or Similia. If anything, we're not putting enough pressure on Russia because we could simply block its shadow fleet and confiscate its assets, etc. But we don't do it because we're so laid off because we think that the war in Ukraine is going to end soon with essentially its stops. And so Russia went nowhere and we're sort of completely retarded in the entire point. And so, that's it. That's from a position of power. It's not from a position of, oh my God, we're scared that the Russians are going to invade or that we're going to be without energy. It's dumb, right? We keep even importing some Russian stuff. That is a problem, but it's not evidently one that favors particularly Russia in the bigger picture, considering how much we stopped disproportionately to bite them. You can even have a system that goes on and on, but for what? Right? Do you realize how much the Russians lost in general? Well, such an autonomous European pole that is already autonomous, right? We're not anybody's vassals or serfs or whatever. Like largely the interaction, the cooperation with the United States derives from an obvious civilizational continuity, which other countries sort of behave like we do. There is also proximity in the North Atlantic in everything, but it's the same relation that we would have with Australia. Right? And it's not like in Europe, like we know much about Australia to begin with, like on a normal, regular basis, nor about the United States, but it doesn't take much to understand. And even other other allied countries like Japan are not that. They are something very different. And this is much bigger, it seems to me, in the moment than any other consideration. Then, again, immigration issues is a problem. If the majority of sort of New Zealanders are going to become non-white, that is, culturally speaking, a big problem. And that's, in fact, essentially possibly the single most undermining aspect of this whole. It's not really even the lack of cooperation, because it seems to me that Europeans actually do work pretty well together. There's just few motivation to do things, but it's not like we are threatening one another, we're crippled in division, we can't have things like everybody basically follows the train. There isn't much else to do to begin with. It's our interest, it's straightforward, obvious, self-evident. And all these crises have actually cemented that further. That's why, as I was saying before, Russian propaganda brutally failed. And so a more united, let's say, better pole of European federal nature could establish frameworks of commerce governed by mutual rules, security, arrangements free of hierarchical dependence, and partnerships predicated on equality, thereby eroding the spheres of influence architecture that sustains the current triad's advantages. Because this is also a language of power and politics. As Europeans will always be peers, right? Our entire history is dominating the world, even though remain distinct, as equally and constitutionally and identically European. That's the magic of Europe. Nobody has ever done this. This is unseen and irreplicable everywhere. This is a spiritual glue. It's not a matter of sort of preferences, changes of mind. Europe is going to stay Europe. Even when it was battled over by the same Europeans, it would stay Europe. There was never a moment to say, okay, well, Europe failed at this point. Or we're simply, even when the European Union did not exist banally enough, that we're not Europeans, or this is not a cohesive thing. The fact that there are struggles within is actually a good sign, like of dialogue, of discourse, of conflict, of antagonism, of competition, because it spurs internal growth and power in intertwinement, integration. All right. The post-Cold War liberal order structure around U.S. primacy, multilateral institutions, and transatlantic security guarantees generated substantial shared benefits, unrivaled American influence coupled with dollar hegemony, European integration yielding deep commercial interdependence and historic stability, and widespread poverty alleviation via the so-called globalization. By the way, there are people who decided that I'm a globalist for some reason, just so that you know. I don't really understand even exactly why they claim that, perhaps because they claim that there should be a world empire. Well, welcome to Indo-European theology and imperial Catholic tradition, for that matter. Aside from that, there is no doubt that the world changed. I mean, if at Bretton Woods, the Americans had literally 2/3 of the world gold reserves, and they could literally dictate a specific development and needed a developed Europe out of the ashes of World War II to counter sort of the ashes of World War II from the other side, sort of the bad part of Europe. So to say, the question is, the thing does not exist anymore because we developed as hell, right? And at this point, that push has sort of gone down. Other countries have bridged a little bit the gap. It would not much better results, telling the truth, because they're still very distant, they're still very more recent, they're still a product of westernization by any degree. And in any circumstance, you realize that they're much more imbalanced systems compared to us. I mean, basically every problem that we have in the moment is the problem that they're having worse, or that they're going to have worse soon. This is notorious. Look at demographic imbalances in China, just to make an example. They are scary, right? But this is true also in Russia, for that matter. So claiming that Europe has some unique issues in this regard, it seems to me pretty asinine. The same goes for the United States, for everywhere, right? So the attenuation of this quote-unquote world order that could control just so much, by the way, stems not from foundational flaws, but from, again, this redrawing of connections based on such development elsewhere. If anything, the greater problem is not even that this order does not exist anymore. I mean, there are certain institutions that in any case were always essentially the West, were NATO, so just like the United Nations, completely useless institution in many ways and devoid of any actual practice, because it feeds this fantasy that there is such a thing like international law. This is not rhetoric, it's literally there isn't, right? And especially there would be if there would be someone who's able to enforce it, which is not. So it's something else. And so we shouldn't fetishize these institutions per se, right? What mostly, again, nothing really changed from World War II to this point. We're still there in terms of Western alignment. It's the East, actually, at this point, we've managed to absorb in great chunk in Europe, and it's prospering through a Western model for obvious reasons. What mostly here we can play on, and also in a civil and essentially pacific way mostly, is correcting certain imbalances that were formed. For example, China's 2001 World Trade Organization entry severed trade from alliance cohesion, permitting essentially mercantilist practices that accelerated deindustrialization in partner economies while accruing disproportionate gains domestically. As we said before, like China has a monopoly on so many incredibly important assets and goods that habituated in a global trade, of course, market to provide, in fact, the same and allowing for the flourishing of this shared economy. This is what China itself, sort of up to this point in particular of growth, has wanted and still wants, mostly markets remaining stable. This is also what brought to not to actually favor Russia more than much, right? Just to maintain a lifeline, to not to make them collapse, basically, because China does not want any of these kind of dramatic conclusions. So there is a very sound also braking system for which, the likelihood of major global warfare is fundamentally off the table, because nobody is going to gain anything from it, right? And it's not like these partners are not aggressive in different ways, right? China didn't have much problem to wipe out entire ethnicities away from its own world with terrible means that only communism in its sort of defacing brutality has ever achieved, probably in the inherent worthlessness of any kind of people, right? That's what they are about. That interdependence in this sense morphed from a pacifying mechanism into a vector for coercion when international alignments diverge. Multilateral bodies proved ill-equipped to redress asymmetries or confront dependencies, render strategic through selective restraint or denial. And this is the moment in history in which this problem will actually increase, because I don't believe really that there's going to be a massive sort of AI explosion in terms of actually expandable, especially generating energy. There can be some sort of reordering of system. There can be some massive time saving, so many different aspects. So yes, the system will grow, but that in strictly material aspects, that this will simply bring to about like massive production. This is not immediately obvious, and it's not even likely at all, right, by any socioeconomical prediction, and for different primarily political, moral reasons. But it's obvious that, again, when even this massive giants starts going down, for example, China demographically being surpassed by India, you realize that also their posture changes, that in times, again, of crisis or stagnation, countries tend to become more protectionistic, more isolationistic, more sort of regionally based, more difficult to dislodge from those bases. And this is also part of the reason why we're witnessing to this new world's kind of enucleation. This is actually what I remember still in primary school books was drawn in the sense, look, there are these different worlds, these different spaces. We mostly treated them by which stage of development materially they were in. And now we're just seeing that basically they're political domains. All right, more or less, naturally, the picture is much more complicated, and it's going to stay complicated. Again, geopolitics does not exist look at what Russia is turning into. Like, that's sort of the likelihood of it probably becoming a failed state is small overall, but the erosion of its autonomy, as we'll see now, is rampant, to say the least. Very differently from Europe, that does not actually exhibit any of these signs. On the contrary, it's sort of like sort of the big animal that is waking up and sort of looks like, I don't know, a polar bear. It's all, after the winter rests, has to stretch muscles and so on before starting to walk in that sort of awkward fashion, but it still has massive muscles, and it's ready to, to rip those seals apart all around. Now, the successor landscape confronts Europe with compounded perils, obviously subordination through division and gradual industrial erosion amid dual pressures, an America that accentuates burdens over reciprocity, deploys tariffs and territorial conditionality that, however, again, are sort of very mildly showing in this sense, and people make an enormous fuss about this, but it's just more like somebody behaving crazily from the other side and you sitting there saying, well, okay, let's hope this doesn't happen again. And it's a problem, but it's not the end of the world. You have China, that seems much more worrying, monopolizing choke points in value chains. We can do similar things with everybody, for that matter. Here I'm seeing it from a very defensive European perspective. It's like 19th century maps, looking at sort of mostly the country only, not the surroundings, because we're habituated not to act to invade the surroundings. But Europe is this puzzle for everyone. There's no way to tackle our power, to substitute it, to actually dominate it, to dismember it. Somebody tried and they didn't succeed. And I think it's sort of self-evident why it is difficult or de facto impossible to do so. None of these powers as a whole is able to basically tackle the other. We should be very consistent about it. This is not just about Europe. The problem is considering Europe as some sort of weakly divided and hopeless and decadent thing. This does not seem to be the case at all. It seems, if anything, something ever more courageous to tackle, and regardless of any sort of internal issue, there are lots of problems all across the world and among all these powers, and they're also very similar, demographically, for example, and with all these economic issues requiring also a rethinking of broader set of strategies, the same rearmament, and more. It's mostly a political issue, but it's still there, and it's still logical and straightforward. One can't fake the picture. Another negative aspect of Europe that, however, is a huge market in this sense that the United States rely on as well is the persistence in the European acute reliance on U.S. provisions for energy security, cutting-edge technology, and conventional defense. This was particularly highlighted by the war in Ukraine, while Chinese dominance in rare earth processing sustains leverage, as we've seen, over the green transition, with vulnerabilities exposed by 2025 export curbs that highlighted Europe's indirect exposure, even through third country suppliers, and prompted production delays or shutdowns in automotive and other sectors. Regarding military industry, technically there are lots of European companies that can and are actually doing a lot. The point is that in Europe, we basically relied on this idea that the United States would be sort of fully in for the essentials, and that we would put mostly money and sort of basic product. Think about shells. Like at this point, by the way, Ukraine, we didn't talk that in the last video about Ukraine, but fundamentally in scale now, Ukraine makes it, and especially in defense, regardless of all other problems, because it's not that simple, but still shelling is quite important. As we've seen also drone-wise, things are sort of in comparable scale. So it's not like everything is going to go well there, but Europe said, okay, we're going to give the necessary, and as much as we can give, because we really gave in terms of sort of harder, sort of more constructed especially vehicles, military infrastructure, a lot, right? A lot of what we could give. Like for the United States, it would take really very few to simply support Ukraine. And now we'll see, because as you've seen, today's news revolved around the idea that Zelensky said that the US realistically, by the way, want a peace in Ukraine by June of this year because of also midterm elections as a proper result. What if that fails, however? What kind of posture the United States follow? Of course, it will keep supporting Ukraine. And it's difficult to tell there what will actually change, what has actually changed from now, except the fact that Russia is ever more exhausted and Ukraine is too, but at least is in a condition that is conducive to further resistance anyway. And with this hardware support so far, things still go, right? You can't complain rightly about, I don't know, they don't have Starlink, they had to shut it down and everything. That's a problem. That's one of the bad things that we're highlighting before, as well as many others, pretty sort of bad stuff that Trump administration made in cutting this or that lifeline for certain specific sectors, the Ukrainian defense. But if you look at the broader picture, the broader problem is strategy in that war, right? And also political will from the Ukrainians to change much of their posture, etc. It's not one of those situations where this single thing will actually change the war, or is actually speaking of an absolute decisive choice from the side of the United States. Okay, we're abandoning Ukraine, now we're signing with Russia. That's ridiculous, right? How do you even enact that, right, in the world? Like, how do you think that, in this sense, the European Union is going to react in terms of general political, economical alignment with the United States, American domestic, so probably public opinion? It's unfeasible, it's unattainable. In the truth, it seems to me that the Trump administration has been disappointing in managing the Ukrainian situation, but not much because they didn't try to create the preconditions for a settlement. Probably they're actually succeeding even on the long term. The problem is that they didn't care about showing that they would give further pressure, they would pressure Russia further, which is something probably, again, if there is really, say, not an ultimatum, but a deadline by June, is going to be increased, probably on both of them, both on Ukraine and Russia. Also because, again, this war is winding down in many ways. And so at that point, you have to understand their perspective as well. They want peace. The Americans don't care if all Ukrainian demands are met. This has nothing to do with Ukraine, quote unquote, losing the war, or the Americans letting it loose in any meaningful sense. And good luck never, but still, in an ironic way to Russians in trying to think that they can win at this point. So you can't you can't enforce a deal with somebody that is increasingly exhausted, right? And you can even exploit that, even maybe bypassing European Union, but between Russia and the United States, where especially the major infrastructural connection is concerned, including the same, as we've seen, American-European ties across the Atlantic, it's a bit difficult for any realignment of power whatsoever, even if an administration wanted this. And the majority of Americans, in any case, don't want that. So that for making you understand how distant we are at any major systemic structural level from anything of what people sort of fear or claim is going to happen because of propaganda and other issues, like this should be a bit more and better acknowledged. Now, what can Europe do in all of this? Well, let's simply look at what it's already done, what it's doing. And so let's pass to the part of the video in which we see how successful Europe actually is in many fields, and just looking at sort of even a narrow set of examples. Now, Europe's countermeasures emphasize deliberate trade realignment and industrial fortification. The EU-India Free Trade Agreement, with negotiations concluded on January 27, 2026, in New Delhi at the Hyderabad House after rounds resuming in 2022, and the final formal session in October 2025, eliminating or reducing tariffs on 96.6% of European Union goods exports to India, with phased implementation for sensitive sectors, while granting India preferential access on over 99% of its exports by value, creating a combined market exceeding $24 trillion, encompassing nearly 2 billion people. This accord, described as the, quote, mother of all deals, enhances access for European machinery, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, aircraft, automobiles, currently facing up to 110% duties, electrical equipment up to 44%, iron and steel up to 22%, and premium wines under progressive liberalization, while opening European markets to Indian textiles, leather, footwear, tea, coffee, spices, sports goods, toys, gems, jewelry, and certain marine products with immediate or staged duty elimination in labor-intensive sectors. Beyond tariffs, provisions cover services liberalization, notably financial services and maritime transport, custom facilitation, digital trade, professional mobility, supply chain resilience, and support mechanisms, including 500 million euros in EU aid over 2 years for India's greenhouse gas reduction and sustainable industrial transformation. You understand, by the way, what this is all about in a broader international sense. It's not just like our enormous land masses, right, in demographic and economical capacity. It's really consolidating an axis, right, reinforcing, for example, India as far as interaction with China is concerned across the border, because they, routinely shoot each other once in a while, and the shared interest in the safety of Red Sea trade routes, right? That at some point it seemed, oh my God, look, Iran is financing the Houthis. Oh my God, it's so dangerous to pass there. You understand how things eventually dwindle, because these are ragamuffin, quote unquote, powers that can't even sustain themselves on their own. Russia has to get, drones from Iran because it really can't sustain much of that. At least, they have gapped the bridge, but initially, they have to rely on these countries to have any kind of, let out in sort of broader coordination to harass Americans in different parts of the Middle East. All right. Now, the agreement has this Council adoption, legal scrubbing, signature, European Parliament consent, Council conclusion for entering into force, realistically targeted for 2027-2028. But this major deal with India is there, basically. And this is largely also the consequence of Trump's reckless, especially tariff policy, that seems to be the major problem for Europeans. We have this massive market power in any case, and you endanger that, you make things more difficult for us and for you. Well, we'll find another partner, except it's difficult here to see what kind of partners the United States can boast on the longer run proceeding like that. This is why it's probably going to largely be sort of a temporary phase, while the EU can still strengthen ties with more competitors out there, that even if they're interested as well. Concurrently, the EU-Mercosur Partnership Agreement and Interim Trade Agreement signed on January 17, 2026 in Paraguay and the Central Bank of Paraguay following political accord on December 6, 2024, and Council authorization on January 9, 2026 by qualified majority 21-5 with opposition from Austria, France, Hungary, Ireland, Poland, and Belgium abstaining. Lower barriers across vast South American markets encompassing Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The package, after over 25 years of negotiations, by the way, aims to boost trade through tariff reductions and market access enhancements, though it faces ratification hurdles. European Parliament referral on January 21st, 2026. to the European Court of Justice for opinion procedural compatibility, splitting the deal to bypass full national parliamentary involvement, potentially delaying provisional application for 18-24 months and freezing 2026 tariff cuts pending judicial review. This naturally is a problem of the aforementioned conglomeration of different states, but it's also the only way we can go. And as you see, by the way, these deals were brokered essentially over a quarter of a century, because it's not like 25 years ago. We were in a situation where we simply wanted to be autonomous from the United States, right? As far as the relation with South America or India were concerned. But it's interesting in any case because the deal was finally triggered and signed by the recent United States tariffs. And if Trump had not sort of shouted tariffs all the time, probably, many Americans would have more worthy currency in their pockets, right? Now, these instruments transcend conventional commercial aims, serving international diversification to counter U.S. tariff threats and mitigate Chinese dependencies as well by redirecting flows towards partners aligned on rules-based norms. This also overall shows how ever more entwined the world is, so that technically, in spite of tensions of these crisis issues, etc., this redrawing, all right, is happening, first of all, only at a certain level, but it's also part of a bigger interdependency of the world entire, right? This kind of dependency was, unthinkable even 20 years ago, right? The systems were incredibly less developed compared to now. Europe commands decisive positions in strategic domains as well. Near total control of extreme ultraviolet lithography essential for advanced semiconductors, approximately half of worldwide commercial aircraft production, and leadership in marine propulsion systems powering global shipping. Individual member states, however, fall short of medium power thresholds for independent coalition building in this volatile setting. Collectively, the EU wields unparalleled scale, serving as principal partner for over 70 countries and sustaining surpluses in key bilateral relationships. Just imagine if we were able to step further into a more unitary direction and just negotiate with a power multiplier. We're already well placed. You can't imagine what that could be easily, like an immediate gain in a much more rationalized and strategic way of handling our power. Now, federation thus proves indispensable where trade intersects security. Confederal modalities in defense, industrial policy, and foreign affairs render Europe susceptible to exploitation of commercial strengths against security weaknesses. Pragmatic federalism offers the viable path, incremental advances with coalitions of the willing in feasible sectors, each tethered to the objective of authoritative common institutions. By the way, we've seen it again with Ukrainian military production. Some countries that were financed for providing especially large amount of shelling. There is an incentives, there are sort of shared, again, European investments in all of this and building their further defense. We'll see now mechanisms of interconnection at the same time, providing again with an expendable that is already there, unlike before. And this crisis, in any case, does compact power because it highlights much more directly where the threats come from, and so there is a shared will to fix that. The Euro's trajectory exemplifies this dynamic. Pioneering groups established robust mechanisms in solidarity, gradually incorporating additional participants. In this, we are overwhelmingly successful. Initiatives in energy, technology, defense, or diplomatic need not achieve universal adhesion immediately, yet must cumulatively advance towards substantive active federation over diffuse coordination, right? This is already happening because you can sort of barely tell the difference at some point between. It's mostly a matter of will. It's not of formality or institution, but of true commitment. This trajectory specifically and uniquely, markedly diverges from the United States' primacy pursuits or China's externalization of domestic costs. This is a much more accessible, efficient, and solid plan. European construction relies on, therefore, just voluntary commitment, reciprocal gains, and non-hierarchical relations, demanding yet durable. This is unique to our culture. We are definitely the one that exhibits it more than in any other part of the world. Viability manifests in concrete progress. For example, the Security Action for Europe, adopted by the Council Regulation of the EU in 2025/1106 on May the 27th, 2025, and entering force on May the 29th of the same year, provides up to 150 billion euros in competitively priced long maturity loans, maximum 45 years with 10-year grace periods for member states' defense investments, focusing on joint procurement, capability gaps, and reinforcement of the European defense technological and industrial base. By late 2025, 19 member states submitted national defense investment plans requesting around 127 billion euros indicatively. The Commission approved the first wave in January 2026 for Belgium, Bulgaria, Denmark, Spain, Croatia, Cyprus, Portugal, and Romania, unlocking approximately 38 billion euros with provisional allocations based on solidarity principles. For example, Romania up to roughly 19 billion euros. A second wave cleared Estonia, Greece, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, and Finland for around 74 billion. Poland alone, for obvious reason, 43.7 billion euros, with loan agreements pending and first disbursements anticipated March 2026. This is Europe's rearmament, right? And it's key to it all. It's a vast amount of money. These funds accelerate military readiness and modern equipment acquisition under the Readiness 2030 framework. When you look at it, it's really impressive also because we are still among the greatest military powers in the world, and altogether, even as Europe alone, we're definitely unassailable, right? There's no way to tackle Europe without nuclear warfare, and nobody can get into that. France, Britain alone have the capacity of taking out the major opponents. And in general, the entire point of doing this is nonsensical for anyone involved. We are disproportionately powerful, right? And if anything, I'll make a video about this too. Now, these restrained, precise instruments, market diversification, institutional consolidation, regulatory enforcement, selective capital adjustments, enable effective counter-coercion absent dramatic rupture. And that is not in sight either, right? Remember how skeptical people were about the European Union, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Here you don't hear of it anymore, right? The whiners, I don't know, some memes, and there are lots of pages that actually support the European Union. You can easily see those going against it are bots fundamentally. Europeans are okay with the European Union, namely, even on paper, those who disagree are also actually the least influent people in Europe and do not practically understand. It's like as if you ask a child, right? Well, they don't know that. They live in a reality that evidently is good enough not to realize the issue. And you see, these are not issues based on when you see the propaganda against the European Union at this point. It's not much a matter of immigrants that are actually a greater problem. Nobody seems to discuss this today. I mean, again, the more Americanized media and X, etc., show you as if it was all like, Finnish white or Swedish white, depending on the part who you want. people counting as white people, and I don't know, just sub-Saharan blacks as the dichotomy or the word race, right? It's not like it's not there. I appreciate everything that is stated against like the Islamization of Europe or whatever, but it's just an incredibly small niche. Most people here do not care, do not look at this stuff. They have their own opinion. They're largely against uncontrolled immigration, whatever, but all the propaganda is against, unsurprisingly, the idea of the European Union as an institution. Not even because of what they do. It's just like saying, oh no, it's not true, like Europeans do not like the European Union. That's it. And it's not even true, because we know that, by polls, that it's drastically not true, that the solid majority of Europeans is all in the European Union. As we described this, is it not speaking of limits? This is exactly the point. Europeans want a stronger European Union. How can you flip that? Just through memes? It failed, right? It's not working. It has not worked. Now, entwinement with the US economy affords calibrated pressure, meticulous compliance audits, data sovereignty mandates, certification rigor, measures that incrementally diminish corporate margins and elevate US borrowing costs through market signaling rather than outright confrontation. And this is obvious. Again, we're not even interested in moving away from the United States, nor the United States are from us. Escalatory options persist for intolerable thresholds, yet moderation exploits structural asymmetries. Hegemonic strain invites repositioning by third parties, while Europe can emerge as a credible anchor of stability. Probably as a way of life, as a quality of life, as probably a different philosophy, and there are pros and cons. I mean, the memes again on X about European life or American life, or we are better, your worse, whoever says that. It fails to understand the broader picture, right? And when you look at, so we go full circle here, the war in Ukraine, Russia's predicament bolsters the assessment that we just made about Europe, right? If we stretch, like here, the visual across the entire board, and we realize, but didn't NATO have to fall? Didn't the West have to fall? Didn't Ukraine have to fall? Where are we now? Approaching 4 years, the Ukraine war has yielded no strategic breakthrough for Russia, despite localized advances. Assessments from imprisoned ultranationalist Igor Girkin, also known as Igor Strelkov, a former FSB officer and self-proclaimed military leader of the Russian-backed separatists in Donbass during 2014, who has been detained since 2023 on extremism charges, including letters from late 2025, such as those dated November 25th and 26th, underscore attrition. This is what Girkin says, that he's not, again, a guy who loves Ukraine, let's put it this way. It's a ultra sort of Russian nationalist separatist that brought to his imprisonment. Why? Because the extremism we're talking about, for which he was literally sentenced to 4 years in prison, is his criticism of the Russian war in Ukraine, the way it is actually, the way it is, and the way, in this sense, also the Russians handled it in general, right? So he's in prison in Russia. So again, definitely not a pro-Ukrainian. Let's see what Igor says. Ukrainian lines hold integrity. Rare strikes intensified on Russian economic and infrastructural targets. Reserves deplete. Economic industrial strains accelerate with declining production, rising inflation, exhausted reserves, and the necessity for full war economy mobilization previously evaded, simply because it's too unpopular, by the way, for Russia, for Russia and for Putin even to launch. Again, this should have been done if they had been seriously committed to it in any meaningful sense since the beginning. At least it was a wave of mobilization, but then it should have been sustained to bring to any sort of considerable result. And obviously, as predictably, the Russians didn't have any moral force to even think that they had to be committed in a war that they didn't have any idea what it was or whatever. Gherkin highlighted that despite earlier economic growth in military and civilian sectors, for reasons that we all know, at the beginning of the war, the withdrawing of the entire economic, that not just what was injected artificially to sustain the rubble and everything, but in general, like the initial oil, gas, sort of high energy prices spike that would advantage Russia, and that would, however, set it on a track of militarization of the industry, of the entire sort of country system. The picture, Gherkin says, reversed sharply by late 2025, with the state unable to sustain the war without comprehensive wartime economic measures, and that tactical gains in select areas like Ulaipole or Orehiv lack reserves for operational exploitation. That we documented, in fact, in the last video about Ukraine. Everything is becoming ever more confused in the front lines because probably there is no order. Ukrainians learned to fall back a bit more elastically. The Russians essentially do not push as hard as they should because they simply can't. And so rendering, obviously enough, as we know, I mean, it doesn't take Gherkin to understand that, but rendering broader strategic objectives unattainable without addressing systemic manpower and industrial constraints. That Russia at this point is very far from even thinking that it can trigger. Ukraine's exhaustion strategy capitalizes on these frailties, with Europe furnishing a shielded rear safeguarded by nuclear deterrence thresholds as well. Russia's reliance on nuclear posture for relevance amid conventional stagnation designates it as the system's weakest pillar. The prospective sick man whose implosion will spur contestation favoring proximate, culturally attuned actors like Europe over competitors. Right? This is incredibly important. In the last episode about our Ukrainian war coverage, we analyzed the final exhaustion of Soviet stockpiles, for which Russians paradoxically have more tanks now than at the beginning of the war, but they're largely Soviet trash plus sort of barely repaired ones. And now these are, traditionally speaking, considering the rates, not just the rates of Ukraine, but the fact that Russia needs that armored force to keep the country together to begin with, for deterrence and non, is running out because the war costs 1,000, 12,000 tanks a year, and Russia can produce modern tanks by 200-300. And so basically in a couple of years, if this continues, they will literally lose every tank they have, which is unsustainable for Russia. So the war is going to end anyway. This is not a good picture. Ukraine does not have this issue, right? They have other issues, but they're also tired, to say the least. But they're not exhausted, and especially Europe provides with adequate support. All right, things can escalate into some sort of broader drone warfare. We've seen that basically Russia wants to escalate the amount of drones crew operators by the hundreds of thousands, exactly in the moment in which properly enlistment is faltering. So basically the picture is, aside from the bloody attrition of 30,000 casualties a month, the fact that Russians do not seem to invest in infantry anymore. So they are actively withdrawing together with the exhaustion of tank capacity. And let's not even talk about the training of the crews or anything. It's all fucked up. It's all collapsed. Like, look at how they advance. It's minimal scale of what they're done for, right? For real. This escalation towards drone warfare means that there's not going to be infantry to seize terrain. Because if you shift to, say, 300,000 drones operators and you don't have even records, because incentives do not work anymore, you can't find soldiers, what are you doing? So you're telling me that half of your is going to be drone operators with seizing terrain. We don't understand what's happened. We said it since the beginning. So in the picture here, given the sake of the video, Europe remains incomplete but not impotent. Especially, Europe remains powerful. Instruments of power, regulatory authority, financial mass, industrial primacy lie at hand. We already have them. We just have to organize them better. Though sovereign exercise lacks, in fact, ingrained reflex. Exactly. So we think that things are going to go fine anyway, and nobody can attack it. It sort of makes sense, right? Russia alone has managed to, however, this massive, military sort of rearmament, whatever you want to call that, that is going to further make it slide towards incapacity, even just by sheer deterrence. Ukraine imposes short-term restraint, yet hastens maturation via successive accommodations and recalibrations. We're spending a lot of money for Ukraine. That is exactly where we should spend it. And we spent it even too few. And things could have gone much better, and the war could have went down much earlier had we actually done it more consistently since the beginning. So it was silly not to do that for everybody involved, United States included. Prolonged dependencies toll steadily outweighs federation's hazards. The decisive variable is temporal. When subordination's burdens eclipse unity's demands, that convergence draws nearer with an inexorable momentum. But in this sense, looking at sort of historical perspective, civilizations do not disappear out of like that. Like there is always, first of all, like there must be a takeover by somebody else, which, as we've seen, is off the table. And secondly, like the most developed parts of the world that prorompently, to say the least, include Europe, remain the most advanced parts of the world, right? Somebody can rise again, and again, there can be this more messed plurality of powers that are not going to be particularly easy to handle, and that will require further armament, and strategizing, and whatever. But also speak of entwinement, speaks of mutual interdependency. So things do not seem so grim as many people think that they're simply going to be, right? And we can't simply predict the future by saying that this is it, right? Most likely fails, but the fundamentals, the bases are not altered, right? We know that the likelihood of any of these changes to be, say, this radical foundational changes, we does think that China is going to disappear as a power, the United States, of Europe, right? Or even Russia. Even Russia. Like, nobody says that. No analyst cares. There is probably no interest or care in their perspective. We're looking at essentially relation in relative terms with one another, and we look at the European perspective, you realize that this whole story, that again, we're obsolete, weak, we're just here, right? Splendidly, as affluently stagnant and sort of quarreling, but substantially and structurally robust, unassailable, and ineliminable, untackable, right? Uninfiltrable, uncontrollable, all right? And just further unification, which is actually happening towards a ever more federal, and by the way, also identitarian and traditional conservative standpoint, is just behind the corner, right? And so I don't see really much sort of going wrong down that path. We'll see, right? And this is the beauty of history, the beauty of life, its tragedy, its terror, so to say. That's all like war is. That is beautiful after all, right? Because without this, we wouldn't even think of ourselves. And the horror and the pain and the unspeakable suffering of people. There is something that catalyzes the same mechanism into some greater civilizational accomplishment. And I think Ukrainians understand this very well. This video, again, was relatively novel in terms of analysis. Sometimes I thought of this structure just in terms of basically, let's make an organic, comprehensive picture of the wall, and let's see if it works, and probably did. I know that for some reason you're going to watch these videos. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.